Welcome back with a smiling face. Links to previous episodes are given in the video description, so don't forget to like, subscribe and share the video. Echoes of Shattered Destiny. Episode 21. Chapter 161 to 170. Congratulations on completing your first spell. Cordelia's smile was small, hiding something I couldn't quite place. How does it feel to call on your magic and have it respond? It was moonlight alone that allowed me to see her delicate features from where she sat on the patio chairs. The leather cords around her neck were dark, but the silver charms that dangled from them glittered merrily. A frown ghosted across my face and disappointment filled my bones. I didn't do that correctly, did I? Not at all, but you tried, and your magic did respond. She replied, patting the seat beside her when my sour expression deepened. Come sit with me before we go inside and sort this out. Everything all right out here? Rowena's flowery voice trickled through the small opening in the sliding glass door. We're fine, just a bit of sigil magic gone awry. Cordelia shouted back, but kept her eyes locked on my face. A slight twisting sensation in the pits of my stomach told me something was going on with the two witches. Rather than ask, I sank into the seat I once occupied and waited for her to speak. Now, tell me. What did you do wrong? I schemed the spell again and again until heat flooded my face and neck, followed by the embarrassment of missing something so blatantly obvious. I was supposed to paint the sigil on myself, not the porch. I mumbled, closing the spell book, and peering down at its leather cover. Cordelia's hand on my shoulder was meant to reassure, but before she could speak the words Rowena's voice floated outside a second time. Cordelia, could I have a word with you? This time a head of auburn hair appeared from the darkness of the living room, barely visible beneath the moonlight. Rowena wasn't able to see her agitated expression, but I could. The gnashed eyebrows and pursed lips were off-putting on a face as kind as Cordelia's, and for the second time tonight my stomach twisted with the feeling that something was amiss. When the back door slid shut behind her and the sound of their muffled voices faded, I turned my attention to the box of supplies she'd handed me. Within the mix of half-burnt candles, herbs, and oils was an old mirror. Other than being chipped at the corner, it was in decent enough condition. That's why the mirror was in there. I snorted incredulously, pinching the bridge of my nose when a chilling sensation danced up my spine. Deep within the forest, I could feel them watching. The shadows were still keeping their distance, hiding from me after giving Brianna back her wolf. It didn't matter how many times I asked why, there wasn't a single whisper tossed in my direction. Rather than succumb to the anger that sprouted when they refused to answer my questions, I began flitting through the stack of spell books Cordelia left outside. There was one in particular that caught my attention, mostly because of its cover. It was made from a pitch-black leather with an odd texture I'd never felt before. Each individual page was lined in silver so that they caught the light each time I turned to a new one. Just as I found the first spell in the book, and realized what type of magic this one depicted, Cordelia was taking it from my hands and snapping it shut. Oh, no you don't. She shook her head much like Grandma did when she caught me gearing up to steal one of her sweets before dinner. I can see the look on your face clear as day. You're not ready for something as complex as protection magic. Even Maya's attention was raised by the stirring of magic in our veins, coursing through our body and leaving little pinpricks in its wake. It rushed through us, flooding my head with chemicals even stronger than adrenaline. As it grew to a crescendo, I knew it wasn't coincidence I was drawn to that particular spell book. For some unknown reason, I needed it. Cordelia's eyes never left my face, even when my hands twitched with the urge to snatch the book from her. I bit back the intrusive thought, swallowing it along with my HR and surprise. There was a part of me ready and willing to tear it from her hands, no matter the cost. I wanted to stay far away from that side of myself, no matter how much I knew those spells could help. The older and much more experienced witch could tell I was fighting an internal battle and captured my attention by clearing her throat. "If you'd like to come inside, I believe Rowena is ready for you," she said, her voice firm but not unkind. Rowena was, in fact, not ready for me, though I wasn't going to openly question Cordelia on that. Instead, I turned my attention to the dozens of pillared candles scattered around the living room. On the living room table was the great leather-bound book I started reading my first day of training. I'd learned what sigil magic was, along with natural and a hint of divination. Before I could swipe it off the table and get to reading, Rowena appeared around the corner, heading from the kitchen where Grandma's humming could be heard. There was a tension within her delicate notes that gave me pause. "Is everything all right?" I questioned, craning my head to catch a glimpse of Grandma. Rowena's auburn hair and flushed cheeks got in the way. "Of course everything's all right. There's an electrician on the way. I'm quite sure you blew the fuse box." I was referring to Grandma and, I frowned, trailing off when I saw no sign of my dad's bulky frame. "Where's my dad?" "Out here." I heard him shout and spun around to see the front door wide open with my dad standing just outside. Before I could ask him what he was doing, he nodded his head in Grandma's direction and grunted, "Don't look at me, look at the witch in the kitchen. She's the one that kicked me out." For a second I thought he were referring to Rowena, but then Grandma's voice snapped back. "I wanted you out of my hair. You were hovering so close I could barely think." Dad snorted and narrowed his eyes, sending his bushy eyebrows colliding into one another. "Yeah, well, you got what you wished for, didn't you?" "No," she tossed over her shoulder, "I can still hear you." A gust of wind tore through the house, promptly slamming the front door in Dad's face. "Well, wasn't that convenient?" Rowena said cheerfully, a glimmer of pride in her eyes as she glanced at Grandma. I had no choice but to follow as she shooed me back into the living room. Now, don't worry about your father, he's perfectly fine. Your grandmother's barred him from entering the house, it seems. It'll wear off in time," Cordelia added, gathering the small stack of spell books in her arms before pausing at the stairs. There was a glimmer of light in her eyes that felt familiar yet foreign at the same time. "I'll see you tomorrow, Lola." Without so much as a nod in Rowena's direction, she went upstairs and slipped into her bedroom. Rowena gave no notice, or at least she pretended not to. She didn't need to glance in the direction of the stairs to tell me she too felt the tense air between them. Left with more questions than answers, I had no choice but to turn my focus to the large textbook propped on the table. The next magical types in Rowena's book were divination and elemental. As I dove into the first paragraph, I found myself instantly missing my best friend. Brianna had said if given the choice, she'd pick divination as a magical skill. The further I read, the more I respected the subtle yet incredibly powerful magic form. Fragments of the past and future were just within reach for the witches able to practice divination. Most needed a reflective surface like a pool of water or even a crystal ball, but others more powerful need only sheer will and determination. Divination itself was incredibly accurate, but it was the future that could change on a whim. Where divination itself was considered a passive form of magic, elemental was its complete opposite. The two women that had chased Brandon, Clara, and me through the streets came to mind, stirring up a feeling of dread that left me with a dry mouth. I could still feel the heat of her flames and hear the rage in her voice when she realized we managed to thwart them. Clara had mentioned that elementals were rare, coveted amongst witches to the point that they would send them off to be specially trained and raised by other elementals. The entire thing felt wrong even back then. The number of elements and the ways that they could be manipulated were near endless, varying in power from monstrous waves to small sprinklings of hail. I'd been neck-deep within the thick-cut pages when I noticed Grandma's small form flit from the kitchen and out the front door. In her hurry to take the plate of cookies in her hand outside, she'd left the front door cracked. Try as I might, I couldn't help but listen in on their hushed conversation. "Anything? Anything at all?" Grandma asked, growing more urgent the longer Dad was silent. "I'm not feeling much of anything, well, except for the usual pain," he replied with a gravely voice, noticeably rougher than usual. Grandma slipped inside and closed the front door, her expression solemn as she shook her head at Rowena and darted back inside the kitchen. The clank of pots and pans rattling against one another did out her quiet muttering. Rowena's lips fell in a sympathetic frown, and with her high cheekbones and elfish features, she appeared much younger than her mid-20s. "Rarely do spells work the way you intend the first few times," I caught her telling Grandma in a hushed voice. "You'll get the hang of it, I know you will." When she emerged from the kitchen I pretended to be hard at work, craning my head back over the book even though my mind no longer cared for the handwritten words. Only for a couple of seconds could I pretend to be oblivious to the failed spell my grandma had tried. Eventually my nagging curiosity won out, but before I had the chance to ask, Grandma came into the living room. Her hands were full of baking supplies along with a large tote on her shoulder. "Grandma, you heading out?" I inquired, catching her before she could flee out the front door. The promise I made to Amelia came to mind. "I had a favor I needed to ask you. Do you think you could get in contact with Chris? One of the trainers wanted to offer him a job. I know he most likely won't take it, but I told her I'd try." Grandma paused, and from the way her slender eyebrows lifted, and lips parted, she hadn't expected me to ask that particular question. "I'll give it a shot, but knowing Chris I'll have to threaten him first, and threats are much less effective when sent through the post." She huffed, a disgruntled look crossing her face though I knew she missed her old friend. Moving away from her cottage hadn't been what she wanted, but she'd done it for me. "Any particular reason you're in a hurry to leave?" I mused, slowly closing the book in my lap. It would have been useful if I could figure out how I did that trick with the front door, but my magic seemed more than happy to lay dormant now that I had use of it. Grandma had her hand on the doorknob and was in the process of opening it when she said, "Claire's friend is getting married tomorrow night and she asked if I'd help with the desserts. I have a lot of baking to do and very little time to do it." Momentarily forgetting the odd exchange between her and Dad, I felt surprise morph my face. Someone's having a wedding in the middle of all this. I gestured to the room around us, even though my true meaning rang clear. There wasn't a single one of us here that could forget the events that transpired just the other day. Grandma tilted her head ever so slightly, her eyes relaxed and understanding. "If you can't count on love in the midst of tragedy, then what good is it?" Those were the words she left me with, because half a second later she slipped through the front door and instantly began bickering with Dad. The two of them were quick to leave, putting down the road in Dad's beat-up Nissan. "Don't you dare," I called out to Rowena, who was in the process of fleeing as well. What kind of spell was she trying to do? "I'd tell you not to repeat this, but your grandmother will find out either way. She's a very intuitive witch, I'll give her that." The red-headed witch sighed, shrugging a shoulder as she settled onto the couch. "She was trying to heal your father's leg. It's tricky magic, but he was more than willing to act as her test subject." A softness filled the depths of her mossy eyes. "From what I've heard, Flora has a fondness for dancing. I can only assume your father has access to the same information, and what better place to dance than at a wedding? Any chance I had at studying was tossed out the window, since all I could think about was my dad and a woman who had just woken up from a decade-long coma dancing the night away at a stranger's wedding. For a moment, I was dumbfounded. Things had changed so much, become so complicated in such a short amount of time that I was just now realizing I hadn't even begun to process it all. As I stood from the couch and gathered my things, my mind was a haze of denial and acceptance. It was Holly's name on Rowena's tongue that freed my thoughts and brought my attention back to the present. I thought I'd tell you before you left, Holly is progressing quite nicely since you found her that therapist. I know it's only been a few days, but she's actively trying now in a way she hadn't been before. From what she's told me, even her nightmares are beginning to ease up. It was a bright spot in an otherwise terrible week, one that was made worse on the drive home when Madox mind-linked me to let me know he and his team of warriors would be moving out tonight. There had been an altercation between some vampires and Alpha Brand's warriors, both of which were much too close to our borders. I had only a few short hours with Madox before he had to leave. It was a naive hope that our time would be relaxing, free of stress or worries about what might come next. Not only was I terrified at what Alpha Brand had in store, and worried for the vampires I swore to protect and defend the pack against, but I quickly realized I had another problem the second I opened my bag and looked inside. Some small part of me noticed it had felt heavier when I slid the strap over my shoulder and left the house Rowena and Cordelia occupied, but I hadn't given it any thought. Staring down at the pitch-black cover and odd-textured leather, I tried to recall when I'd slipped the book of protection magic into my bag. I was more than positive I hadn't, especially considering the look Cordelia had given me, the one that told me she knew how badly I wanted the book. Yet here it was, perched on the countertop of Madox and I's house, practically begging me to flit through the silver-lined pages. Chapter 162. I hadn't so much as schemed my fingers over the cover page when Madox came through the front door. A jolt of surprise swallowed my voice and made my heart rate jump, forcing me to snap the book shut and slip it back into my bag. Madox rounded the corner and appeared in the kitchen before I could question my sneaky behavior and why the feeling churning in my gut told me to keep the book a secret even from him. The next few hours I spent with Madox were anything but relaxing. Even after taking out the rest of my frustration in the cushy master suite he had designed for us, there was still plenty weighing on my mind. I'd always envied Chelsea for her lack of conscience, especially lately. Both Maya and I knew that keeping Cordelia's book was wrong and that thievery, no matter how it happened, had consequences. The urge to return it with a heartfelt apology was strong, but there was something even more powerful brewing in the back of my mind. It had found its way into my bag for a reason, I assumed. One could only wonder if the reason was to look inside, to use its magic to protect my mate, pack, and kingdom. Even though the feeling lasted but a few seconds, it was the excitement that gripped my heart in its hand that ultimately influenced my decision. 00:00/00:00 Pub Future Fantasy 2. Are you alright? Madox's voice was soft, which was warning enough that I'd been quiet for far too long. Unable to forget what had transpired not that long ago between him and a certain judge, I lifted an eyebrow in his direction. With a drink in each hand, he abandoned the bar cart in the lowered alcove that served as our lounge and made his way to the canopied bed I was currently sprawled across. I took the glass from his hand and took a drink, feeling the strong scented liquor sting my lips before racing across my tongue. Forcing away a grimace from the taste was easy enough. Shouldn't I be the one asking you that? You should. He grunted, and from the deep scowl that hardened his jawline and made those soft lips of his fall, I knew his next words would be worth my while. Only after a long drink of his own did he finally speak. "I won't apologize for what I did to Clint Armstrong, but I'll admit I did act rashly." For a split second, his eyes unfocused and confusion filled their depths until all traces of gold faded from his irises. I haven't been feeling like myself lately. There was some part of me that wondered if magic was involved, but both the witches have checked me over and neither one felt anything. Could it be stress? At training today, Cassidy mentioned we don't know everything there is to know about alphas. There's a chance this could be what happens when an alpha's pack is threatened from all sides. I stumbled for a reason, startled by the feeling of helplessness that encased my lungs. Madox didn't struggle, he conquered. When he lost his footing he'd come back stronger, fight harder until his opponent snapped in two. Seeing him like this, with genuine confusion in his eyes, it was jarring. I know what stress feels like, believe me. I've had a lifetime of it, even before you stumbled into training late that first day. He said, his voice quickly morphing from dry to light and amused. My own lips perked up at the sound of his laugh, and of the memory that pitted the two of us against each other. He sat down on the edge of the bed and took another drink. When you turned yourself into your father's men, that was the most stressed I'd ever felt. All of this is nothing compared to that. Madox, you can't mean that. We've got witches, vampires, and now werewolves coming for our throats and none of that means st to me. He rasped, running a hand down the stubble that coated his jaw. His head sunk a few inches, and only when I placed my hand beneath his chin did he dare look up at me. I would have handed over your entire pack if it meant getting you back, Lola. You mean that much to me, so much that my own people can't even compare. I'll protect them with my last breath, but only if I know you're safe. There was an urgency in his voice that made my throat tighten. I tried hard to cling to my disbelief but failed when I saw the heat in his eyes. So believe me when I say, I know what stress feels like. Maybe you and Cassidy are right, maybe this is some alpha thing we haven't discovered, but if that's the case, we need to get figuring it out because I'm slipping, and this pack can't afford a slip. The more we talked, and the more Madox opened up, the more I was able to see his hesitance and indecision. Part of me wondered if I'd still feel the same all-consuming love when Madox's guard was let down and his indestructible alpha persona was removed. It wasn't surprising that my affection for him reached an even deeper level, and that the bond between us sparkled like freshly spun threads of gold. He was still an alpha in my eyes, but even alphas had moments of weakness. We'll figure this out. I promised him, though I had no clue how we'd achieve such a thing. If the witches couldn't figure out what was happening with Madox, who could? An idea popped into my head, and I found myself smiling with just a shred of renewed hope. Brianna's parents might be able to help. I'll mind link her tonight and see if she can get in contact with them. All right, just keep me posted. I'll be bringing Mason and Clara with us tonight. Having a witch on our side will be helpful, and Mason can keep her in check since she seems to enjoy tormenting him. Madox grunted, combing his fingers through his hair, oblivious to the way my eyes tracked the movement. Seconds away from suggesting a round 2, I registered his last-minute decision. The one where he thought bringing Mason and Clara anywhere was a good idea. An odd sensation warmed my stomach and a fleeting thought whispered in my ear, "Isn't this what you wanted? You're bringing them both." I pondered, ignoring the gut feeling I was having that told me I somehow caused this spontaneous decision. "Not only that, but I'm also bringing Brandon too," he replied, his tone just a tad disgruntled. Taking one last swig of his liquor, he rolled his shoulders and twisted his head to either side until it popped softly. Seeing the expression on my face, he snorted. "Believe me, it wasn't my decision. He was lurking on mine and Zeke's conversation and overheard we were leaving on a mission. I can't have him spilling the news to everyone in the pack and risk it falling into the hands of whoever our leaks are. Zeke's babysitting him at the moment, but sooner or later he'll try to escape him. How is Zeke's pack doing? I wondered out loud, standing from the bed and stretching my sore limbs until they groaned in pleasurable pain. With a smirk painted across my lips, I tossed one of Madox's shirts over my ND torso and flopped down on my stomach. He's rarely been there since all of this stuff started happening with the witches. His beta is a good, honorable man. He's stepped up a lot and has helped him run the pack. I'm sure it helps that the witches aren't particularly interested in the other nearby packs. Strategically, it makes sense that they'd want to dismantle the strongest pack first. Even alphas look up to the strongest wolf. With our pack gone, the rest in the country will weaken. I suppose I should thank the witch Cordelia, Madox rumbled, making a sound in the back of his throat that I couldn't quite place. Whether it be gratefulness or dismay, the gesture surprised me. She's been helping Zeke fortify his borders with some of those sigils of hers. From what he's told me, they're nothing serious, more like alarm systems in case any witches or vampires slip through. Oh, I hadn't known. Wouldn't the same thing help us? At the very least it could give us a heads up on the next MR. She's already placed a few around the pack borders. She would have done it sooner, but the magic required apparently takes time to build up. He half shrugged, still seemingly unconvinced. I'm trying to trust them, but only because you asked it of me. As Madox slid into the driver's seat of his Audi and revved the engine, a sliver of worry crept into my throat. It twisted around my neck, scratching at my skin like the scales of a serpent before sliding down my esophagus and into the pits of my stomach. It was this feeling that told me what Madox, Zeke, and the rest of the group they assembled were going to do was a bad idea. I was going to tell him, even though I knew it wouldn't change his mind, but another voice more powerful than that of my otherworldly feeling slid into my head. It wasn't her words, but the tone of fear within them that made me pause. Lola, you there? Ugh, stupid men. Kendrick bailed on me for some curvy red-headed SL whatever, the details don't matter. I'm here with Lars at his camper thing and he's acting all sketchy and tweakish. I know you said to stay away from him, but I'm freaked out and I need some help, and you're the only person I know who won't hold this over my head. Chapter 163. You're telling me that not even 24 hours after I left, you're driving to some creepy guy's camper in the middle of the forest because Cassidy made the mistake of hanging out with him after you warned her not to. Brianna deadpanned. The dry tone of her voice through the mind link made me clench my hands tighter around the steering wheel. Yep. I replied, popping the P for emphasis. Even though that's not why I mind linked you. I know. You mind-linked me to ask if my parents could find anything on alphas that the world doesn't already know, which is unlikely but yet I'll ask them. She replied with a small huff. Now back to what you're currently doing, which is driving into certain doom without telling your alpha of a mate what's going on. I'm not driving into certain doom. I rolled my eyes, but yes, that's what I'm doing and no, Madox does not know about it. If he did, he'd turn right around and demand he come with me. Well, since there's no talking you out of it and Cassidy needs help, you need to take someone with you. She insisted, right as always even though I was currently low on available werewolves. Who said they have to be a werewolf? Maya mused. Without needing further clarification, I let out a long sigh and adjusted my route to a certain vampire's house. When I strolled through the front door, taking a mental note that it was unlocked, and popped my head into the dimly lit kitchen, it wasn't Tristan's lean form I saw standing at the stove, but Holly. It had been so long since I'd seen her that I didn't even notice the charred grilled cheese sitting on the plate she cradled in her hands. Her pin-straight hair was the same silken ebony as mine, though she often wore hers in a long braid that fell over her shoulder. "Oh. Hello, Lola," she said softly, in a voice much higher than my own. Her eyes rested on my face and were unblinking in a way most people found unsettling, but I knew she was simply giving me her undivided attention. There was a wispy quality to her voice that reminded me of wind chimes swaying in a gentle summer breeze. She blinked once and tilted her head. "Something's wrong, isn't it? Tristan will be back shortly. He left to get me more cheese. I've been trying to cook, but I'm afraid this stove works too well." She gestured to the stovetop, which was set on high heat until the burner glowed a bright shade of red. I glanced down at the square-shaped charcoal on her plate and reached over the stovetop to turn the dial down to medium heat. "Try it again, that should help." "Tristan didn't teach you how to control the heat?" I questioned, watching as she tossed the charred sandwich in the trash and grabbed 2 more slices of white bead. "As for what's wrong, a friend is in trouble, but Tristan should be able to help." He breezed through it, but I'm afraid I wasn't paying much attention. He was in one of his moods, you know. Didn't quite understand why I wanted to learn to cook to begin with, especially since he can make me anything I want. She half shrugged, the serene expression on her face unfaltering. "I'm sure he'll help, but only if it's you or I who asks." "Is he ever not in one of his moods?" I joked but found myself wondering what she meant with that comment. Holly let out a quiet chuckle and began smearing butter along the slices of bread. "I didn't know you didn't know how to cook, but I suppose that makes sense. Father primarily fed me blood, but truthfully I prefer human food." She hummed under her breath, and as she finished the beginning stages of her grilled cheese, she set the butter-coated bread down and turned to meet my stare. Her nails drummed across the countertop softly. "There's something you want to do, but you're feeling guilty about it." "I can't tell anything else, other than it has to do with magic." I opened my mouth, expecting my brain to catch up and formulate a reply, but nothing came out. Surprise unfurled across my face, lifting my eyebrows, and reddening my cheeks. "Did you see this in a dream?" "No, I picked it up just now," she explained, swiping away the strands of ebony hair that spilled over her slender shoulders. "Ever since beginning therapy, which I should thank you for considering the therapist you chose is quite lovely, it's been easier to use my magic. The less nightmares I have, the more I seem to pick up while I'm awake." Unblinking, she hit me with a look that made me wonder what exactly went on in that head of hers. "You can ask me for help, you know. You tried to be close to me once, and I pushed you away. I wasn't ready for a sister then, but I am now. If it helps, I'm quite good at secrets, you'd be willing to help me." I couldn't help the surprise and skepticism that bled into my voice, along with the kernel of hope that she was being truthful. Even if it meant lying to everyone. Madox's face flashed in my mind, eyes pitch black with fury. He'd be more than pissed at me, but I'd risk everything right down to our bond if it meant keeping him and this pack safe from harm. He needed me, he needed this. "Your mate is no threat to me, Lola." She reassured me with a small half-smile, but it was her knowing tone that struck me as odd. "Now, what kind of magic do you need help with?" Swallowing back a wave of indecision I said, "I want to put a protection spell on Madox." It wasn't surprise that morphed her heart-shaped face and lifted her soft eyebrows but interest. "I'm in." She nodded, and while the gesture would have seemed normal to some people, I could tell there was an eagerness within it that hadn't been there before. "Does tomorrow night work for you?" I need the day to gather the supplies and study the spell book I have. I told her, leaving out the part about Madox and his whereabouts. My mate and the group he'd assembled would make it to the borders of the deserted pack by tomorrow night, but only if Alpha Bran and the vampires lurking about didn't slow them down. Just don't tell Tristan, I began, but was cut off by the front door swinging open, followed by the scent of salt water and male musk. Tell Tristan what? The blonde-haired vampire asked, his pale eyes washing over my face before flitting to Holly's. They had lingered on the marks on my neck for a fraction of a second, and I ignored the slight pull I felt in his direction. Lola and I are going to have a girls' night tomorrow, isn't that wonderful, Tristan? Holly said in her sing-song voice, closing her eyes as she smiled at the vampire that towered over her by a good 2 feet. You're having a girls' night, he grunted, his sandy eyebrows gnashing together as dread filled the depths of his angular face. Don't be so sour, it's not that bad. I snorted on impulse, rolling my eyes at the grim expression on his face. The vamp had brooding down to an art form and was even better than Madox if that were possible. It's going to be at her house, Tristan. What better way to finally leave the house than to visit my sisters? Holly scolded him, but it was almost playful how she laughed and tugged the package of cheese out of his hands. We'll be fine, I promise. You're more than welcome to tag along if you think we need the protection. Lola's going to teach me all about sleepovers and what normal girls do at them. Instantly I picked up on where she was going with this, but before I could play along I had to SW the nervousness I felt when realizing how well my half-sister could spin a lie. Oh, I'll be pulling out all the stops. Nail painting, makeup, boy talk, popcorn, and the best romantic comedies of our time. Oh, and don't forget the pillow fights. I grinned cheekily, directing it at Tristan, who let out a sharp breath through his nose. Truthfully, the grumpy vampire wasn't half bad when he wasn't trying to seduce me into his den of iniquity. He might be quick to anger and even quicker to frustrate, but he was surprisingly loyal and would go to any lengths to help me. I wasn't sure if it were because I happened to be his queen, or if he was still trying to snare a place on the throne, but I was in no position to decline the help. Fine. Have your girls' night, just leave me out of it. He grumbled, and as though he felt the need to prove my point, he waltzed to the fridge and pulled out a small water bottle of blood. Without changing his expression, he shoved the bottle in my hands and muttered. Just call me if anything happens, all right? Does your mate forget you need blood to stay strong? He's been a bit busy, thank you. I snipped back but took the bottle without hesitation and brought it to my lips. I've been busy myself, which is partially why I'm here right now. I need your help. A sigh bubbled past my lips, though not from the rush of strength I felt as the chilled blood ran down my throat. A friend of mine is in trouble, and I'm the only one she has that can help, but I need backup. Let me guess, no one else is available. He deadpanned, and the tone of his voice offended me a little. We don't have the best relationship, but I trust you. Even though you've given me more reasons than I can count not to, I do. That seemed to appease him, or perhaps it was the sincerity in my voice, but I was genuinely happy to see his disgruntled expression fade a bit. Go on and help Lola, Holly urged, nudging him in the direction of the door before turning her attention back to her slices of buttered bread. I have a feeling this one will turn out perfect. Where are we headed? Tristan asked. I replayed Cassidy's hastily given instructions in my head and said, the woods, to some guy's camper. Oh, you are. Holly's eyes instantly perked up, and for the second time her grilled cheese sat forgotten. I had a dream about a camper just last night. It has to be for you, I can feel it. You didn't tell me about that dream. Tristan pointed out, his lips tilting downward. Holly shrugged. It wasn't a particularly long dream, but there is something you should know, she trailed off, and as the tone of her voice switched from soft to ominous, I wondered if this dream of hers was actually a nightmare. When you see the purple eyes in the forest, run. Chapter 164. Don't bother asking me what she was talking about back there, because I have no clue, and yes, I'm just as worried as you are. Tristan huffed from the passenger seat, his scowl directed out the window and towards the impenetrable wall of darkness that filled the forest and the night sky. Most of his attitude was from the fact that I wouldn't let him drive, but I needed the distraction since the fear in Cassidy's voice continued to increase with each update she gave. Purple eyes. What could that, Lola? Please tell me you're close. Cassidy's voice came through the mind link as a whisper. I slowed down to take the sharp curve up ahead, narrowing my eyes to peer through the darkness. Acting quickly, I showed Cassidy a quick mental image of the stretch of road we were on, and visibly jumped when her hushed whisper tore through my head faster than the shadows that dashed across the road to flee the car's bright headlights. Turn onto the gravel road and take it to the very end. You won't see me there, but you'll see him. What? Cassidy, why won't you be there? I hadn't realized I'd asked out loud until Tristan turned to stare at me, his face strained and skin even paler than usual. I'm hiding, was all Cassidy said, followed by a shaky, I swear I didn't want to do it, Lola. You have to believe that. She did something, she won't say what. I told Tristan, grinding my teeth as the gritty crunch of gravel sounded beneath the tires. Goddess, I have a bad feeling about this. The dirt road Cassidy told us to drive down was narrow and curved in patterns that seemed to have no purpose other than to send us plunging further into darkness. The deeper we went, the more the sickening feeling in my stomach grew. The car's headlights only illuminated 5 or so feet in front of us and were our only source of light. I stopped just in time to avoid plowing through a chain draped across 2 poles hammered into the ground. Your goddess isn't here, Lola, but something is. Tristan said darkly, narrowing his eyes at the obstacle blocking our way. Cassidy, there's a chain and a no trespassing sign here. We can't go any further. I warned her, twisting, and turning my head for any signs of life or movement. Rolling down the windows increased the feeling of danger in my gut but gave us the chance to listen for anything within the forest. Get out of the car and follow the trail on foot. You didn't say anything about a trail. I replied both out loud and via mind link, giving Tristan an uneasy look as I gripped the handle of the car door and slowly pushed it open. I don't like this, he muttered, getting out of the car, and walking around until he hovered close by. His eyes scanned the darkness, but I knew he saw nothing when his scowl deepened. It's not often I get creeped out, but this is concerning. The big bad vampire is afraid, I chuckled weakly, wincing as the thud of the driver's side door echoed loudly. A trail of icy fear trickled down my spine, because for once the shadows weren't fleeing. They stayed where they were, curious and patient as Tristan and I slid past the rusted chain and willingly ventured deeper into the forest. What are we even looking for? He asked several moments later, his voice muffled from the intense ringing in my ears. The earth crunched beneath our feet, and the air was surprisingly warm as it coated our skin in a thin layer of sweat. We followed the winding trail until the trees began to disperse and a small clearing came into view. The canopy of trees overhead was thick, blocking most of the moonlight from streaming through. The only light available was that of the tiny window in Lars's camper and the 2 tiki torches protruding from the ground on either side of the front door. There was a foul stench radiating from the camper, seeping from its slatted walls of sky blue paint until the air was dank with the stench of DH and rot. "Do you smell that?" Tristan whispered, his entire body going tense. I nodded ever so slightly. "That smell, it's a DD body. One that's been here for a while," he murmured, eyes trained on the front door and the light flickering through the window. Tristan went to move forward, motioning for me to stay close. Together we approached the front door, both of us holding our breaths as the KB squeaked and hinges squealed upon opening. At the last second I heard Cassidy's gasp through the mind link. "Lola, don't open that!" I gagged as a gust of the putrid scent blasted me in the face and had to SW back chunks of my dinner when the bloated and misshapen face of Lars appeared from the cushion of an antique-looking sofa. He was lying on his back, his head twisted at an awkward angle so that his eyes were looking in the direction of the front door, the same one Tristan and I had just come through. There were 2 blades protruding from his body, both coated in blood so dark it looked fake. One was a thin pocket knife, lodged just below his eye still within his orbital socket, while the second was where I assumed his heart rested. "Where is your friend?" Tristan hissed under his breath and turned to look me in the face. His eyes were wider than I'd ever seen them, flecked with worry so strong panic seized in my chest. I stammered. "She's here, she can see us. She's saying," Cassidy's whimper filled my head. "Lola. Lola, you need to get out of the camper, now." "She said we need to get out of the camper," I repeated, my voice grave and eyes sliding from Tristan's face to that of Lars. Bile churned in my stomach as I added, "Now." "Why?" Tristan demanded, pivoting to survey the entirety of the camper. Apart from the rotted body lying on the couch, much more decomposed than he should have been, we were utterly alone. "Ask her," he demanded. "Why do we need to get out of the camper, Cass? What happened here?" I KD him, but he was already DD. I swore I heard her sob. "Why do we need to get out of here?" I repeated myself, this time hardening my tone until it bordered on a command. "Because he moved, Lola." A sickening crack filled the small camper, followed by a crunch that made both Tristan and I lock eyes. Despite the fact that the mark on my neck and the connection between a vampire and its queen weren't quite like a mind link or mate bond, a sort of understanding passed between the two of us. Before I could turn that flash of understanding into words, our eyes slid to Lars's corpse, which was now sitting upright on the sofa. "Cassidy, I'm going to need you to come out from where you're hiding," I instructed her, swallowing a scream when Lars turned his head to stare into my face, the bones in his neck cracking and crunching from the movement while the knife below his eye remained rooted in place. "When you see Tristan and I run, you have to follow. Do you understand me?" "Yes, I understand." Her reply was instant. Slowly, like prey cornered by a hungry predator, I wrapped my hand around Tristan's wrist and took a small step backwards, towards the open door. "We can't KL something that's already DD. I told him, the haunting tone in my voice evident no matter how quietly I spoke. He didn't dare break his stare from Lars to look back at me, but I could see the slight nod of his head and knew he was on board with whatever last-ditch plan I concocted. Together we took a step backwards, and then another. On the third Lars's corpse stood, its spine ramrod straight despite the bulge of crushed bone and tendons in his neck. His eyes never once left my face. Each step we took led us closer to the front door, but quickly Lars began matching our steps, taking one each time we did until Tristan and I stood on solid ground, and Lars within the doorway of his camper. A split second with our feet on fresh soil and I heard a scrambling sound from beneath the camper, followed by a flash of knotted golden hair when Cassidy rolled from beneath the thing and Army crawled to our sides. She was shaking like a leaf and coated in that dark, foul-smelling blood, but still managed to look murderous in her form-fitting dress and feet. I don't know what kind of magic this is, but it's evil, it's pure evil. She stammered, lips trembling even though her stance was one we'd learned in training. There was only one form of magic that came to mind, one that could have easily been capable of causing this. If this is blood magic, that means the witch orchestrating all of this is nearby. I swallowed heavily, refusing to shrink under Lars's empty stare. Tristan tensed beside me, undoubtedly thinking the same thing I was. Holly's mother was within our pack's borders, she had to be. There was a small flicker of movement to my left, one fast enough to catch my eye. Two specks of purple appeared from deep within the trees, glowing softly within the darkness. I could hear the distant rumble of a car's engine along with the roar of a tricked-out exhaust and knew that what I was seeing were the headlights of someone's modified car. It was the way they moved in tandem with one another, gliding through the trees all the way from the main road we'd turned off of, that looked eerily similar to a set of eyes. "Tristan," I hissed, jabbing my elbow into his ribcage hard enough to garner his attention. His eyes flickered in the direction of the lights and understanding filled their depths. "What do those look like to you?" "Purple eyes," he confirmed, and not a moment later the brush surrounding us began to tremble. As the sickly sweet scent of vampires filled the clearing, Lars lunged from where he stood in the doorway. "Run!" I issued the one-worded command and turned on my heel in time to see not one, not two, but 6 figures break through the tree line. Chapter 165. Razor-thin branches slapped at our faces, stinging our ankles and any visible piece of skin. The darkness was all-consuming, the shadows thick as they surrounded us like the heavy fabric of a cloak. If only they protected us the way a cloak would, if only they offered their assistance as they had numerous times in the past. Something changed since I got my magic, and that something was big enough to alter the way the shadows acted around me. In the past, they'd jump at the opportunity to be of service, to exact a price they saw most fitting. Their whispers would plague my mind, their slippery voices a haunting song of desperation, excitement, and longing. I could hear their whispers, only this time they didn't seem to be speaking to me, but to each other. Flinging them around the forest so quickly I couldn't make out what they were saying. "Wait a second!" I panted, gritting my teeth together as Cassidy stepped on something sharp and snarled angrily. The scent of fresh blood was instant and made what I was about to say even more important. Those were vampires. Cassidy sucked in a sharp breath, swatting away the stray branches as they whacked her in the face. "As far as I'm concerned, just as scary as witches." The whites of her eyes were visible as she glanced at Tristan, who ran in between us. "No offense." "None taken." He huffed. "You said the guy you stabbed was already DD. I'd given him a rundown of what Cassidy had told me, even though I didn't exactly understand what happened myself. Lars was DD, yet undead? I knew without asking that magic was responsible, but it was a kind of magic I hadn't learned about yet and one I wasn't sure I wanted to. "Sure was," she replied, her voice thick and tinged with both nausea and fear. "He decomposed after I KD him, but I swear I could smell him the second I walked through the door. I thought he left some meat out or something and it spoiled." Tristan nodded grimly, which looked odd considering we were still running like lunatics through the forest in the night. "That's definitely the work of magic, which means the vampires are working with witches. Or at least, some of them are. Lola, maybe you should mind link the warriors." Cassidy huffed, increasing her pace even though she was barefoot and sporting a mini dress. "Cordelia put a spell on the territory. It's supposed to alert Madox and I if there's a breach, but I don't think it worked." I replied, a bit reluctant to admit this second part. I don't want these vampires, KD, which is exactly what the patrol teams will do. You haven't called them. Cassidy gaped, stumbling over a root that protruded from the ground. If it weren't for Tristan's quick reflexes, she would have face-planted. I didn't answer her question, but instead racked my brain for a solution, for some strategy that would allow 2 werewolves and 1 vampire to apprehend not only 6 vampires, but a DD/undead biker named Lars. This was one of those impossible situations only magic would solve, yet I had no clue how to call on the mysterious force that sometimes filled my body and made my skin tingle like a live wire. No one was coming to help. It was only us, surrounded by forest so dense that almost no moonlight could break through. The canopies overhead only allowed the smallest sliver, which is what lit our way as we ran. We were alone, but not completely. The shadows around us were frantic, throwing whispers at rapid fire that I couldn't even begin to make out. Madox would be furious, and so would everyone else, but I was given this ability for a reason, and I'd be damned if I weren't going to use it in times of dire need. I couldn't rely on my magic, not without proper training, but I could rely on the otherworldly power of the shadows. Help us! I hissed, raising my voice so that it carved through the trees and into every dark corner of the forest. Both Tristan and Cassidy gave me identical looks of confusion, though Tristan's quickly morphed to understanding. It was that understanding that darkened his eyes and hardened his jaw. I swore beneath the rustling of foliage and the crunch of earth beneath our feet, I could hear his teeth grinding together. "What are you?" Cassidy began, her words faltering when I dug my heels into the ground and stumbled to a stop. "I know you can hear me." I snarled at them, turning in a circle to stare at the writhing mountains of darkness that hid behind the thick trees and large stones. "Why are you so afraid of me? Why now? Fear? Lola, the shadows can't feel fear," Tristan said, his eyes darting in all directions. I couldn't tell if he were searching for the shadows, or for a sign of the vampires that chased us. They didn't want to save Brianna, but I made them. I made them, Tristan, and they didn't ask for anything in return. I told him, well aware that I was coming off as manic, but it wasn't just our best option, it was our only option. Tristan narrowed his eyes, scanning the forest line. "That's not possible. They always have a price. Maybe they haven't told you it yet." With a snarl, I spun around. We didn't have time for this, for Tristan and me to argue over something I was so sure about. The way their behavior had changed since removing the bind on my magic, it was impossible to ignore. They were no longer eager to make deals with me but were now terrified of my presence. I said, "Help us, it!" I bellowed, balling my hands into fists. There was a rustle from afar, followed by the crunch of gravel and branches beneath heavy feet. Tristan grabbed my arm, his grip almost painful. I shoved him off, using some obscure technique Chris had shown me to slip under his arm, the very arm he tried to hook around my waist. "Lola, you can't," he began, genuine concern filling his eyes, turning them into a set of small oases that glimmered in the dark. The sound of shuffling grew closer, but it was Cassidy's whimper that told me our chance to evade had just passed. "Watch me." Channeling the same horrible emotions I felt when I found Brianna in that clearing was all too easy. Like it was hours ago, I could recall the fear, the utter hopelessness that had filled every corner of my soul, had filled my body with cement until I thought I'd sink into the earth, never to return. If Brianna had died that night, I knew a part of me would have died too. I owed the shadows everything, the life of my mate, and my best friend. It wasn't hatred that kept me from working with them in the past, but fear. Fear because I knew how steep a price they could ask for. Fear because I had felt the kind of desperation that would bring a person to give anything, absolutely anything to protect the ones they loved. As those damning emotions filled my body, it wasn't just the electrical current of magic they brought on, but a dreadful sort of cold that was injected directly into my bloodstream. The forest around me with its vague shapes and distorted bushes sharpened, revealing not only the writhing shadows but the 6 figures that had chased us all this way. I said, "Help us." I commanded them, forcing every bit of emotion into my words until I was sure my voice would crack. 3 things happened simultaneously, each one more confusing than the next. "Oh my goddess," Cassidy whispered, the whites of her eyes huge as she stared at me with an open mouth. The 6 figures burst free from the brush, each one a vampire with glittering eyes and an expression of pure malice on their faces. They didn't have time to register the inky smoke that slithered along the ground, that's how quickly the shadows moved, finally answering my call. Each cluster of pulsating darkness shot out, wrapping around the necks of the 2 vampires standing at the lead. Like glittering spider webs coated in obsidian, they shimmered under the scarce amount of moonlight. Where the first 2 vampires had panic-stricken faces, clawing, and snapping at the shadows that squeezed the life from their bodies, the other 4 were faster in their evasions. 3 of them raised their arms in time to block their throats, though the sticky webs wrapped around their forearms and climbed higher as they thrashed. The 6th managed to leap out of the way, but it wasn't the nimble vampire I scanned the forest floor, but the thing that Lars had been turned into. If only they knew speed couldn't save them. The shadows that avoided me for the last 2 weeks now seemed attuned to my emotions, my wants and needs, no matter how sadistic or depraved they were. The feeling of cold, icy power was addictive, numbing my nerve endings until nothing else mattered but the threat they posed and the lives they endangered. No longer did they feel like a chaotic, otherworldly force I had no choice but to work with. Instead they were an ancient power brought into this world through pain and suffering, a weapon, an extension of my own power and will. I threw my arms out, raising them far above my head, and felt that icy power explode in my chest. At the same time, 100, perhaps 1,000 of those razor-thin webs burst into existence, appearing from the clusters of shadows that had watched and whispered unhelpfully. Chapter 166. Many hit the trees, rocks, and earth, but even more hit the vampires that stalked us, wrapping around their limbs, and tightening their grip much like a snake would. It was both beautiful and deadly, watching them pierce their skin, seeing the looks of apprehension and confusion as they realized I was capable of so much more than their previous ruler. "Lola, remember you don't want to kill them," I heard Tristan murmur, barely registering the sound of his voice over the roar in my ears. His hand ghosted across my shoulder in a gesture meant to soothe me, but all it did was break the haze the addictive power I wielded had over me. The tendrils of shadow that had been tightening around their throats, turning their faces various shades of black and blue, loosened just enough to allow them air. Rather than show my emotions and express the ripple of doubt and regret that passed through me, I steeled my spine and faced them the way a true queen would. "You have all made a grave mistake coming here tonight," I assured them, looking each one in the face from where they hovered several feet above the ground, wrapped almost entirely in darkness and shadow. All of you is well within my power, and well within my rights, but I vowed long ago that I would be a different kind of ruler. Tell me, why have you come here, and where is Lars?" With eyes of varying shapes and colors, each vampire stared at me. 2 of the males, both Hispanic with heads of curly hair, spat at my feet, while the other 3 remained silent. The only female of the bunch, the one nimble enough to evade my first AK, snarled freely. "You are not their queen, Luna Lola," a voice both masculine and feminine said, pulsating from deeper within the forest, like an echo that rippled and spread across the earth. Their true ruler resides within the land of the DD. For now, anyway. Tristan sank into a crouch beside me, all too easily snapping out of his surprise. I saw his face first, pale and covered in dark veins as his blank eyes stared at me through the night. The way he moved, hobbling as he pushed past the bushes and hanging foliage, unflinching even with the knife protruding just below his left eye, struck a chord deep within me. His arms and legs moved as though they were heavier than the rest of him and dredged up a seemingly unimportant memory from my childhood. Back when Mom and I had gotten along, she'd taken me to one of those puppets shows kids seem to love. I remembered all of the other children enraptured with the little dolls, ignoring the wires that controlled their limbs and jaws, ignoring the puppet master behind the curtain, directing their every move. "You're not Lars," I stated, taking a step to the left as I began circling him, keeping my movements slow and steady. Tristan's apprehension was practically tangible in the air between us, which I promptly ignored. The pull in my gut told me keeping my cool and feigning this indestructible confidence was the right move. Both my vampire protector and Cassidy stuck by my side, watching the corpse I spoke to and my back in case any new intruders wanted to make an appearance. I lifted my chin ever so slightly and spoke in a voice free of fear or doubt. It was one I only partially recognized. "Who's pulling your strings, puppet?" Lars's lips split as they widened, dragged across his face in a grin that made the dark veins along his cheeks bulge sickeningly. His laughter was wet from the substance that coated his teeth, much thicker than blood even though it carried a similar scent. His laugh sounded both male and female, like two voices layered over one another. One belonged to a cocky biker, the other a woman. "Where's the fun in asking a question you already know the answer to?" he mused, his body uncomfortably still and his eyes unblinking. "Such incredible power, yet you lack the wits to put it to proper use." Anger swirled in my chest, threatening to melt the ice that held the 6 vampires in place. Another gut feeling told me that if I lost my cool, I'd also lose control of whatever magic it was that gave me power over the shadows. His words chased themselves in my mind, only it was the voice of the woman I heard. Round and round they went, staining my thoughts a bright shade of crimson and bringing the scent of fresh blood to my nose. "You're the Blood Witch." Lars's grin remained rooted in place, across the lower half of his face. "Well, would you look at that, you're not entirely hopeless. Why have you come here?" It was Tristan that sent the question hurling in her direction. "Why orchestrate this AK?" "Why? To speak with Lola here, of course. I had to wait until that mate of hers left, but he's a bit busy handling a mess I made." "Not to worry, he'll make it unscathed, for the most part." I shifted from foot to foot, feeling the icy magic I was somehow using sapping my strength. Slowly, the shadows were becoming restless, frustrated that I'd confined and enslaved them. Lars's grin widened ever so slightly, as though the witch controlling him could feel my hold slipping. "You went through all this trouble to speak with me?" I scoffed, my expression giving nothing away. "I went through all of this trouble to warn you," she corrected. "Your failure is inevitable. It's been written into our history for longer than even I can remember. For centuries young witches have read the prophecies foretelling the unification of witches and vampires, and it all begins with you. Yours will be the beginning of a new world order and will ultimately mark the end of the werewolf species." It didn't matter if what she was saying was true, or that it frightened me to my very core. What was important was this pack and the vampires I swore I'd protect. Even the ones suspended in mid-air, watching our conversation with conflicted eyes, were important. As I always had in the past, I let my stubbornness win out and spoke without common sense. "You expect me to believe that?" I raised an eyebrow, nodding up at the 6 vampires I currently had trapped. If I'm capable of this, I wonder what else I can do. You won't win, I promise you that much, and we will not go peacefully. Try and kill us all, I dare you. I'll personally make sure that every single witch dies along with us, including you. You would have made a decent queen, and an even better high priestess. Perhaps if there is anything left of your soul, you'll choose to be reincarnated. She mused, the grittiness of Lars's voice meshing with the silkiness of hers. I suppose it's time I take my leave. Those dim-witted warriors of yours have finally snuffed out the presence of these here vampires. Speaking of which, they cannot be allowed to live, unfortunately. I do hope you put their blood to good use though, considering I can't while in this body. Oh, before I leave, do give my daughter my highest regards. No. Tristan bellowed and lunged at Lars, both of us coming to the same realization at the same time. Lars slashed a hand horizontally across his throat, and the throats of the 6 vampires suspended in midair were slit, raining crimson blood on the 4 of us. The rotted, decomposed corpse that had once been Lars fell to the ground, lifeless once more. Instantly, my hold over the shadows snapped. They scattered into mist, vanishing within the darkest parts of the forest as they fled. All 6 of the vampires fell to the ground, and I was nearly crushed by one as I rushed to their sides. It was Tristan that pulled me out of the way. I fell to my knees, barely registering the moisture within the soil seeping into my jeans. The heavy drumbeat of my heart rattled against my ribcage, ratcheting my adrenaline higher and higher with every pair of glossy, lifeless eyes I stared into. They were helping her, and she KD them, sacrificed like their lives were nothing, like their families were nothing. A garbled, wet breath pulled me out of my stupor and towards the trembling form of one of the vampires. The lithe female that had darted out of the way during my first AK, she was curled up in the grass, her hands clawing at her slashed throat. Tristan! I called out, scrambling to her side. The blonde-haired vampire knelt beside me, wrenching her hands away and forcing her down when she tried to tear my face off with her stiletto nails. I stared down at her, at eyes the same shade of brown as Sean's. Stop trying to kill me. Only one of us is DG, and it isn't me. You'll have another chance, after we save your life. Her mouth opened, revealing blood-stained teeth and a sparkly tongue ring. Luna Lola, we're nearby. We caught the scent of 6 vampires and followed once we realized they were tailing you. We have the witches with us, they're going to help. One of the many warriors on patrol tonight said through the mind link, followed by countless others, all jumbling into one mess I couldn't even begin to sort through. Hurry! I told him, increasing my pressure on the vampire girl's throat whilst sending every bit of my urgency through the mind link. I counted the seconds it took until they burst through the forest in a sea of fur and teeth, repeating the same plan over and over in my head. We would save her life, and after she was stable and thoroughly questioned, I planned on asking Cordelia exactly why that security spell of hers hadn't worked. Chapter 167. The trick I did, somehow managing to control the otherworldly power that was known for being uncontrollable, left me with little to no energy and a raging case of cotton mouth. Even worrying about Madox, which I'd been doing since the Blood Witch said he had problems of his own to deal with, sapped what little strength I had left. As I swayed where I stood, staring down at the 5 lifeless bodies, the shadows watched from their hidden alcoves within the forest. Tristan stood nearby, his eyes flitting to my face every few seconds as though he were worried I'd topple over at any moment. I sure felt like I was, but I'd never admit that. Instead I frowned at the blood that watered the earth and thought about the words that the Blood Witch uttered. Make use of their blood, I said quietly, lifting my gaze to peer at the darkness that surrounded us. Cassidy continued to gnaw on her lower lip, which she'd been doing for the last half hour. What do you mean by that? Tristan grunted, which was indication enough that he knew exactly what I meant. As reward for your service, you may feed on the blood that was spilled, only that of the 5 vampires who needlessly lost their lives this night. I said to the shadows, my voice strong despite the lead that weighed down my bones and claimed my energy. At the last moment, staring down at the men who had harbored such hatred for someone they knew very little about, I added, all I ask is that you return their bodies to the earth. I wasn't sure if the tendrils of darkness could feel my lack of strength, or if they were simply that hungry, but they swarmed the ground like the fog that often cloaked the entire town in the early morning hours, when the air was thick with humidity. Cassidy let out a sound that was halfway between a croak and a wail, taking several steps back though the shadows still slithered around her feet. What in? She muttered. Within seconds the ground was clean, free from the blood and the bodies of the DD vampires. Lola, are you all right? Tristan said quietly, his voice so low that I had to strain to hear him. You look like you need some sleep. I do, and I will, but only after I figure out how this happened. I told him, thankful the others weren't within hearing range. Have the vampire taken to a cell, one of the nicer ones. I don't want her harmed, I can't begin to stress that enough. I'll stay with her to make sure, but only after you're safe in bed. He replied, and as he held my gaze it wasn't desire I felt, but the genuine need to protect and serve his queen. The handful of wolves on patrol who knew the location of Madox's personal holding cells escorted the vampire, each one under strict orders to only use force should she try and escape, and judging from how much blood she lost, that wouldn't be happening anytime soon. Cassidy was promptly escorted home by a few of the remaining warriors in the patrol team. She must have not been too shaken up because the reluctant glances she tossed our way told me she didn't exactly want to leave. Rowena, Cordelia, Tristan, and myself all ventured back to the estate, where tensions continued to rise until I wasn't sure who was angry with who. The way Cordelia stared at me as the 4 of us stood in the kitchen struck me as odd, especially considering it was her spell that had failed to work properly. For the first time, I was wondering if my gut feeling about her were incorrect. Was there a chance she was one of the leaks spilling information to the Blood Witch? Could I speak with you alone, Cordelia? I asked, shattering the haze of silence that had befallen the 3 of us. Tristan's reluctance weighed on my shoulders, reinforcing the nagging thought that I might have been wrong. As soon as we were alone, her stoic expression fell, deepening the lines that circled her eyes and mouth. You're wondering why my spell didn't work, and I wish I could tell you, Lola, but I just don't know. She placed her hands flat on the marble countertop and stared down at the flat colors. There's a chance it could have been overridden by the Blood Witch's magic, but she would have needed a significant amount of blood to fuel such a thing. The only other option is that those vampires were already within the territory lines when I casted the spell. We'll have to assume that they were, which means I'll have to talk to Madox as soon as possible. I forced the words through clenched teeth, fighting the urge to start shouting down the mate bond, linking his mind with my own and potentially distracting him from what could easily be battle. Even if I did manage to get through, I'd most likely have seconds before I passed out. There's something I needed to talk to you about, Lola. Cordelia's lowered voice and unwavering gaze put a stop to my disorganized thoughts, bringing my attention back to the present. She leaned forwards, skewering me with her eyes. What exactly did you do back there? I blinked at her, flashes of memory dancing behind my eyes. Tendrils of darkness wrapping around limbs, piercing the skin like razor-thin needles that held the vampires in place. I'm not following. The Blood Witch sent 6 vampires after you and reanimated a DD body, yet you and your friends are alive. Not only that, but the amount of residual power I felt was intense, to say the least. Cordelia replied, pursing her lips. The shadows were watching you, child, and don't think I didn't see them clean every blade of grass free of blood. I'm not sure what you want me to say, Cordelia. I murmured, following the feeling in my gut that told me to keep quiet, to give as little information as possible. I don't know exactly what I did, but it worked, and the threat is gone for the time being. Isn't that what's important here? It is important, but it's not the only important thing. She said ominously, her eyes flickering to the same doorway both Tristan and Rowena vanished through. It led deeper into the house, past the living room and curved staircase to the lounge and back door. Did something happen between you and Rowena? I blurted, unable to keep the question at bay for any longer. It had been over a week now that the two of them had been walking on eggshells around one another, Cordelia more than Rowena. The middle-aged witch that reminded me so much of my grandma that it hurt to suspect her as the enemy frowned. Nothing you need to concern yourself with. You've got enough on your plate and we're both grown witches, we can handle a spat. For some reason, I had the strong feeling this was more than just a spat, but I stayed quiet anyway. Late that night, after spending the last 3 hours curled up on the couch in a deep sleep, Madox's voice began to trickle into my thoughts. Lola, are you awake? I got word from a couple warriors on patrol that there's a new face in the dungeons. What happened? Was anyone harmed? I sat up from my spot on the couch, stretching my arms far above my head. Delirious with the remnants of sleep, I groaned as my back popped in 3 separate places, each one cutting Madox's voice off for half a second. Good morning to you too. I grumbled, taking a long drink of water from the glass Tristan left on the table before I slumped over. No one's hurt. Well, not anyone in the pack. Madox didn't miss the way my voice soured, just like I didn't miss the frustration that oozed from his. It's getting worse, much worse. He cursed, his anger vibrating the mate bond between us. Highly saturated images of last night flashed in my head, replaying the battle between myself and the vampires for Madox to see. Things are finally coming to a head. I murmured, shuddering as my stomach dropped and intuition spiked. Without a doubt, I knew what I was saying was the truth. Whatever their plans are, whatever their goal is, they're close. I can feel it. If the Blood Witch went through all that trouble to warn you herself, you must have something she wants. She wants to throw you off your game, get you doubting yourself, so you surrender before the fight even begins. Madox grumbled, both to me and himself. Even though Madox had no magic of his own, his intuition was just as sharp. I padded into the kitchen, wincing against the bright light of the refrigerator as I opened the door. A water bottle full of blood sat on the top shelf, courtesy of Tristan. It's my magic, it has to be. I told him, taking a long drink from the bottle before sighing deeply. After what I did with the shadows, I'm sure of it. The blood in my mouth turned sour from the thought. I twisted the cap back on and placed it in the fridge, already rejuvenated from the small bit I'd imbibed. Speaking of which, what exactly did you do to control them? You're sure you didn't make a deal by mistake? I didn't make any deals. It was similar to when Brianna was hurt, I swallowed, hesitating on my trip back to the living room as the memory of my best friend flashed in my head. I wasn't asking them to do anything. I was commanding them, and they had no choice but to listen. I don't know why or how, but that's what happened. Madox grew silent for a moment before asking, "Don't you have that book Giovanni got for you? The one with your family name on it?" I honestly forgot I had it. It's been tucked away while everything's been going on. I admitted sheepishly, thankful he couldn't see the embarrassment on my face. Perhaps you should go through it, see if it says anything about what you did tonight. Does it make me a coward that I don't really want to open it? It was a big enough bombshell learning I'm part vampire, and another when I found out about my witch side. I'm not sure I want any more surprises in my life. Releasing a breathless chuckle, I sank back into the couch. Madox's response was immediate and provided support I hadn't realized I needed. It doesn't make you a coward. If anything, you could use a bit of caution from time to time. I detected a hint of teasing in his voice and rolled my eyes at the sound. When I get back we can go through it together, yet. I'll hold you to that, Alpha. I said softly, my chest light and fluttering from the fondness in his voice. Already my trepidation was fading, chased away by my fearless mate. But only if you tell me about your night. I know I'm not the only one with a story to tell. You picked up on that, hey? He grunted. As seconds of silence ensued between us, he had no choice but to launch into the details of his own night and the distraction the Blood Witch claimed to have provided. Alpha Brand's men intercepted our group. They attacked on sight without any regard for their own. A long string of curses filled my head, each one more deadly than the next. Came out of nowhere. We still can't figure out how they picked up on our scent. Clara did some magical st and covered our trails. It had to be the Blood Witch, then. I nodded even though he couldn't see it. A dry laugh escaped my lips. They're working with her, they're just too blinded to realize it. I spoke to Madox for well over an hour, relaxing only when he assured me that no one had lost their lives. 2 of the men in his group were injured, but both were taken into Zeke's pack and given shelter until they were healthy enough to make the trip back home. Madox had to reassure them numerous times that they hadn't failed, and that their lives were more important than completing this mission alongside their alpha. Mason and Clara were the main entertainment for the group, it seemed. They'd been at each other's throats since the moment they left the pack grounds, only working together when they were ambushed by Alpha Brand's men. I had planned on asking every single nagging question in my head when my cell phone began to ring. Upon further inspection, I realized I had a few missed calls from Tristan. I cannot tell you how much I wish vampires had that mind link thing you wolves have. His voice slithered from the speakers, tight with agitation. It's unnatural to be this unreliable in the 21st century. Aren't your kind supposed to be glued to their cell phones? Good morning to you too, and if you must know, I was fast asleep. I lied. Also, no. Humans are attached to their cell phones, not werewolves. Nice try. You weren't asleep, you haven't been for the last hour. He pointed out, ignoring my response about humans and their cell phone addictions. You need to get to your mate's dungeons, the faster the better. The vampire you saved wants to talk, and whatever it is she has to say, she'll only say to you. I scrambled from the couch and made it halfway to the front door before realizing I needed shoes and pants. Chapter 168. I shrugged and pushed past him. Not all of us are used to night shift. Judging from your grumpiness, I'd say you're not used to it either. I am not grumpy. He huffed, blinking at me a few times before regaining his composure and leading the way through Madox's maze-like dungeon. The network of underground tunnels wasn't known to anyone in the pack but a select few that Madox trusted. I'd been more than reluctant to venture down there the first time Madox brought me. The entrance was in the basement of a local bar in town, part of the roadways that would allow alcohol to be smuggled in during the humans' insane prohibition. There was a slight sting of alcohol and fermented fruit that lingered within the tunnels, which helped to dull the scent of blood, sweat, and PS. Thankfully, having the vampire placed in one of the nicer cells turned in our favor. The stench was far less noticeable in this part of the dungeon. The walls were made from smooth stone, and there was actually a toilet and small stall that served as a shower, though privacy was an impossibility. Beneath the dim light protruding from the ceiling, swaying slightly though there was no breeze, was the vampire whose life I had saved. She was propped against the wall, perched on the metal bed frame that sat in the corner of the cell. With the barest hint of light, I could see that her mane of curly hair wasn't black but a rich shade of caramel with blonde highlights dispersed throughout. Her deep-set cheekbones casted shadows along her jaw. It was that and the slant to her sculpted eyebrows that made her appear both grim and gaunt. A pair of eyes the same shade of caramel as her hair darted up to meet my own. She had asked for me, yet her expression seemed to worsen as I walked into the small circular room. Her cell was the only one occupied, the other 4 were vacant. "You called." I spoke, unflinching as my voice reverberated off the stone walls and floor. There were 2 guards in the room with Tristan and I, each one standing rod straight on either side of her cell. One of the guards slid a creaky metal chair in front of me, a polite smile gracing his rounded face. The woman blinked twice before saying, "Didn't think you'd show." I opened my mouth to reply, instinctively generating some generic Luna response that would make me appear strong and above it all, above the chaos and the witches had put us through this past month. Exhaustion marred the confident look on my face, but I didn't bother trying to conceal it. I was every bit as human as I was witch, werewolf, and vampire. I take the safety of my people seriously, regardless of their species. I kept my voice neutral, lowering myself into the fold-out chair without breaking eye contact. She turned her body to face my own and glanced up at the 2 guards flanking her cell. "I want them gone," she said, narrowing her eyes until the swirls of caramel brightened to a warm gold. "If I decide to give anything up, it won't be with them in the room. If you decide..." Tristan snapped, his voice cracking like a whip through the silence that encased us. I didn't call her here on an if. The way she was looking at me felt familiar, her eyes hardened like 2 slabs of mahogany, streaked with gold that reminded me of Madox's, only a bit more watered down. It was a look of assessment, one that threatened to slice me in 2, flesh and bone, to what hid deep inside. "She wants to know what type of person I am," I murmured, inclining my head in the same way I'd seen Madox do hundreds of times. "What kind of ruler I am?" Without breaking our staring match, I gave the guards monitoring her cell a dismissive wave. I knew neither one would stray far, just enough to give us the barest hint of privacy. Tristan, on the other hand, remained rooted in place at my side. "So tell me, Luna, queen of all those who walk in the night, who call its darkness our home," she spoke only when the 2 guards' footsteps silenced. The words emerged softly, but despite the delicate tone there was no weakness, no fear within her voice. "What kind of leader are you?" I had no clue who this woman was or what she had been through in her lifetime, but the feeling churning in my gut told me she'd sniff out a fake answer a mile away, and that upon the first whiff she'd shut down completely. "I'm a flawed leader. I'm impatient, naive, and horribly underexperienced. I'm so exhausted, so tired that the moment I wake up in the morning I want to go back to sleep. Even more than any of that, I want peace." I exhaled sharply, forcing the words out in a rush that made my chest feel as though it were caving in. "I'm fighting an impossible war, trying to keep both sides alive long enough to realize who the true enemy is. It doesn't matter how far things get, how horrific. I'll never be able to stop, because stopping means picking a side, and I will not let half of my people d*e. The truth was rarely easy, rarely subtle in its explosion into existence. Short of breath was an understatement. It felt as though the walls were crumbling, like the stone were giving away to damp earth that piled up around me and threatened to swallow me whole. Every slow breath I took eased the feeling of claustrophobia but did nothing to ease the weight in my chest. The vampire woman remained silent for several seconds before she stood and approached the iron bars that kept her contained. Tristan stiffened but maintained his position beside me when I lifted my hand. "My name is Bridget, and I have one last question for you," she said, watching as I rose from the chair. "There's rumor of a town, a place where vampires are free to live, where we're safe. Is this true?" "It's true. My confirmation that the place Madox and I were building, a town for the vampires on our side, was a relief she'd never known." Her shoulders sagged and lips parted, a million questions bubbling to the surface. "Where is it?" she breathed, leaning forward on her feet. I blinked at her, my expression unchanging. "You know I can't tell you that, but depending on what you tell me, you may live to see it one day." Bridget nodded slowly, hope a potent chemical that brightened her eyes and took years off her face. "I apologize for my role in this, just as I apologize for what I am going to tell you." Several minutes had passed since Bridget told me her story, of the life she had left behind when a small coven of witches descended upon the lair she and her mate had formed. Upon my father's death, many of the vampires scattered across the country, slowly gathering to form families of their own. They sought out shelter and food whilst searching for a way to navigate this new world. According to Bridget, the allegiance of many vampires was undecided. Far too many had been seen as disposable to my father, as heads in his army, as soldiers ready to perish for the world he had envisioned. These witches were beautiful, wielding magic they had never seen before. It wouldn't have taken much considering the witches have kept themselves hidden for centuries, but the fact that they were crawling out of the woodwork was nerve-wracking enough. My mate was smart. He was suspicious, made some of the others feel that way too. I should have listened to him," Bridget said dryly, folding her arms over her chest. She let out half of a laugh and said, "He'd say that if he were here right now. I always had to make the mistake myself first before I'd listen to him. Look at where it's gotten me. You might be in a cell, but you're about to save a lot of vampires, one of those being your mate." I assured her, hoping she could see the promise in my eyes, the one I intended to uphold no matter the cost. "I'll tell you where the lair is, but you can't waste any time going. The way we'd keep under the radar was to move locations every couple weeks. It's coming up on that time again, so you have to hurry." The desperation in her voice told me she knew she was out of options, and that this was the biggest risk she had taken. Perhaps even bigger than trusting the Blood Witch. I memorized each detail she gave me, from the twists and turns in the road, to the street signs flecked with a minuscule splotch of glow-in-the-dark paint that would take me to my destination. As I turned to leave, with Tristan at my flank, Bridget's voice rang out loud and clear. "Queen Lola, I'm trusting you not to harm them. I'm trusting you to be exactly what you said you were. If you're on our side, if you care about vampires the way you claim, don't hurt them." Once the guards led us upstairs and we navigated our way through the semi-crowded bar, Tristan turned around and speared me with a knowing look. "You're really going to listen to this random vampire and head straight into a lair that could easily be a trap?" He deadpanned, already knowing my answer. I lifted a shoulder in a half shrug. "It's what a queen would do." "No, a queen would send other people in her stead rather than risk the journey herself." Tristan laughed humorlessly, his slender face haunted by the shadows that formed around his eyes and jawline. "There's no way this is going to end well. You show up with a full squad of werewolves and you might as well declare war yourself. You show up alone and you're all but slitting your own throat. Well, are you coming with me or not? I asked stubbornly. He rolled his eyes and stopped his grumbling. Obviously, but there's one last thing you need to take care of before we go gallivanting to some dangerous vampire lair. Really, what might that be? Tristan turned around and flashed me a smile that was all teeth. You have to tell your mate. Chapter 170. There was no room for argument, no room for negotiation within the gruff planes of his voice. Not a single shred of remorse or sympathy was viable within his words, nothing I could play on or entice to change his mind. Madox, come on. I have to do this, you don't have to do st. He snarled, the sound raising each and every hair on my body until I felt like I'd touched a live wire. You can wait until we get back, then we can assemble an actual team to accompany us. It'll be too late by then. I've already told you that they changed the location of their lairs. If I don't act now, they'll move somewhere else and then we'll never find them. How can you not understand that? I barked, frustration sharpening my voice and tinting my vision in a dull shade of red. I was being insensitive, uncaring of the fact that he'd gone through so much while I was held captive by my father, but Madox was being so stubborn. I might be stubborn, but I'm not reckless. I don't leap into a dangerous situation with the word of a vampire we don't know nor trust. His rebuttal was instant, a barrage of fire and ice clashing within the confines of my skull. If they move locations before we're both able to go, then so be it, but I will not risk my mate a second time. I mean it, Lola. Do not do this. As your alpha and mate, I forbid it. A sound of surprise and defiance slipped past my lips, making several heads in the coffee shop I sat in turn in my direction. I wrapped my hands around the to-go cup I held, tightening them to ease the shaking my rage had incited. Did he just try to alpha command us? Maya scoffed, offense thickening her voice. Hastily, I maneuvered around the growing line of customers and veered straight for the doors. The slew of crimson-tinted emotions I was currently experiencing deafened my ears to the few patrons I heard call out my name followed by a hello. The door jingled as it clattered shut, and a warm breeze lapped at my face, carrying my lowered voice several feet. Says the guy on a dangerous mission by himself with a witch he still doesn't trust. I seethed, so consumed by disbelief and anger that I hadn't noticed Rowena's auburn hair and flowing sundress until I clipped her shoulder roughly. Oh, Lola! She half yelped, placing a hand against her shoulder as she smiled warily. A flash of recognition danced within her mossy eyes and the expression she had turned to one of concern. Is everything all right? I opened my mouth to speak, but she beat me to it with a wave of her hand. Don't answer that, clearly something's wrong. I didn't even want coffee today, but something was telling me to come here. Let's have a chat, shall we? She mused, flipping back the loose curls that trailed down her shoulder. I was seconds away from declining when she said, and I warn you, I won't take no for an answer. All right, yeah. Let's have a chat. I grumbled, sounding so much like Tristan that I took a moment to collect myself. Rowena led the two of us to a vacant bench, her flowy dress swishing around her full hips and clinging to her slender waistline with each move. She smoothed out the back of her dress before sitting down and placed her dainty purse on the bench in between us. While Rowena waited patiently for me to explain, I watched the morning traffic ebb and flow, eventually thinning out as everyone headed to their respective jobs. There was no twisting sensation in my gut, no feeling of mistrust that forced me to remain silent. The vampire woman you saved last night, she gave me the location on where the rest of the vampires are staying. If I don't go right away, my chance at finding them will slip through my fingers. They change the location of their lair every month, but Madox strictly forbade me from going until he gets back. I bit back a snarl and explained the situation as calmly as I could. Rowena made a sound of surprise and raised both of her eyebrows. "Oh, that's not quite what I expected, but I'll try to help nonetheless. Tell me, will they not still be there once Madox returns?" "No, they won't. They'll be off to some new location, and it'll be impossible to find them. The vampire Bridget, she only knows the location of this current lair, and they never visit the same place twice." I sighed sharply, pinching the bridge of my nose when a headache stung my temples. He's still dealing with how it felt to lose me the first time, when I had to hand myself over to my father, but I let him go off on this mission knowing there was every chance he wouldn't return. Now, keep in mind this is simply an outsider's perspective, but have you considered that protecting is in his nature, just as sacrifice is in yours? I'm not excusing or condoning his reaction, but it's merely a thought," she replied, her eyes soft and tone contemplative. "Even then, that doesn't help me decide what to do. If I go against him, I don't know if he'll forgive me. Yet if you stay, you'll lose the one chance you have at gleaning more information on the witches responsible for the death of 2 of your pack members, and the attempted murder of Brianna," Rowena pointed out helpfully. "Also, with how I've seen Madox look at you, I don't think forgiveness is an impossibility." It seemed that even Rowena knew what I would do, that this opportunity was one I couldn't pass up. As much as I wanted to trust Bridget and let that warm feeling of hope build in my chest, I had to remain vigilant. On the off chance this was a trap, I'd make sure the vampires responsible knew exactly what their queen was capable of. "It seems you made your decision, if I'm not mistaken," Rowena hummed, her eyes crinkling at the corners as her lips curved into a smile. When I nodded, she slid her purse onto her lap and began rummaging through it. Seconds later she pulled out a dainty necklace with a teardrop ruby at the center. "You're giving me a necklace?" I questioned, staring down at the golden chain as she slid it into the palm of my hand. "It's from your grandma as well." "Oh, and it's magic?" Rowena beamed, her eyes lighting up at my surprise. "I was going to give it to you at training today, but since you cancelled I figured I'd just keep it in my purse until we ran into one another again. You can add it to the amulet Cordelia gave you, it'll make a perfect addition to your growing collection," she teased, helping to lighten the situation even if it were only for a few moments. "What does it do?" I couldn't help but ask, my curiosity more than piqued. "At this rate I'll have to layer them like a scarf to keep from losing my mind. The spell that's on it is a bit of a doozy to do on your own, so I had your grandma help. It'll strengthen you and help focus your magic whilst playing on Cordelia's protection amulet for some added oomph. You'll notice its effects the second you find yourself using magic," she said with a self-assured smile, clasping her hands over her lap. "I do hope this makes things a bit easier for you. I can only imagine the difficulty of the decision you're making, but in truth, I think I was drawn here today to help sway your mind. I wanted to believe it so much that I closed my mind off to any other option, turning my attention to the protection spell I still planned on casting, and the mission I now had to plan." Thankfully, along the strip of stores within the heart of town, there were more than a few metaphysical shops that held an assortment of candles, crystals, and dried herbs. With Cordelia's book of protection spells sitting like a ton of lead in my bag, I toted it into the locally owned shop and inhaled the earthy scent of lavender and sage. The owner was a fair-haired woman with faint lines around her eyes, telling me she spent the best years of her life laughing, a kind smile carved onto her elvish face. Even though the items in her shop were more for show than anything else, she led me through the small aisles plopping the ingredients I needed into my basket. A few black pillar candles, some jagged crystals I could barely pronounce the name of, and a bundle of sage later, the ingredients needed for the protection spell Holly, and I planned to cast were gathered. All that was left was to wait until dusk, when the sun kissed the horizon and gave birth to night. Join our Facebook and WhatsApp group for more updates, link is given in description. Rest audiobook will be continued in next episode.